I'm Frans Rosen. I'm going to speak about a lot of stuff around what I do. And I work as a security advisor at Detectify, and we do website monitoring for security. So we try to automate a bunch of vulnerabilities that we can identify and tell about them for the developers of those websites. So you sign up with your website and you're able to scan it automatically. So what I do is basically try to find as much vulnerabilities to be automated as possible. I do a lot of blogs about fun stuff I find on our labs blog. And do people know about HackerOne here? Anybody? Yeah, some of you. Awesome. I'll get to that a bit later. So when I show people outside of Sweden this picture, they always like, yeah, you hack stuff. You're dressed as a ninja. But it's actually cold in Sweden. This is like minus 35 Celsius. So this is actually to survive. But I kind of like Swedish ninja, so I tend to use that. The rundown is I'm going to talk about my background and how I started with this, because I'm not like born in security. I actually started just a couple of years ago. And I'm going to talk about how I approach a target in terms of security when I look for bugs. And also about some validation, because validation is hard. And I'm going to talk about free money. That sounds really cool, right? But I'll speak about also, as Andreas did earlier, about some automation in terms of finding bugs. So 4 years ago, I got an email from PayPal, and PayPal said that if you find a vulnerability in PayPal, just send us an email and we'll give you money. Sounds good. So I registered for PayPal, like a merchant account and a personal account, and started sending money to myself and started playing around with that. And suddenly I find a vulnerability. I was able to actually take money from another account, which was bad. So what happened back then was I didn't actually know what to do. Like, that was one of the first emails I got that had that information in it. So like, send us a vulnerability and everything is fine. Like, no legal consequences whatsoever. Like, awesome. So what I did, I sent an email with the proof of concept showing them how to actually reproduce it. And I waited for like 2 months or something. I forgot about it, started doing my regular developing. And then I got an email back from PayPal. And PayPal said, yeah, this is a valid bug. And by the way, we want to send you $750. What's your PayPal address? And you're like, you throw that away, right? That's like spam. Like, give me your address. But this was actually true. They wanted to send me money because they validated that the bug was there. And back then, there weren't that many companies before PayPal. It was like Mozilla had it, Google had it, Facebook had it. But at this time, when PayPal started this, it took off really. Like, a lot of companies started to allow you to hack them. And since I got that email, I freaked out and just like started finding vulnerabilities for all these companies. Like, it became like obsession, you could say. So I started doing this, and not all these companies are sending you money, but they're sending like t-shirts and stuff. So I never had so many t-shirts in my life as back then. Like, they were just, my girlfriend, like, you're crazy. I've never seen so many t-shirts. And it went so far, actually. So we went to Thailand on a vacation, me and my girlfriend. And you don't bring your laptop when you're going to vacation with your girlfriend. But on my phone, I see that one of these companies starts a bug bounty program and are paying out money. And I'm like, I'm going to miss this opportunity to find some bugs. So I found like a super simple bookmarklet on my iPhone to be able to view the source of the web page. And I tweaked it a little bit, and I spent the whole night in Thailand actually sending them iPhone screenshots of vulnerabilities from Thailand. And I actually like excused myself. I'm really sorry, I'm sending you iPhone screenshots, but this is where I'm at. Like, I'm on vacation. So I spent the whole night in Thailand, and I woke up early in the morning, and I had 2 emails from this company with $4,000 in it. Because not only had they validated that the bugs were there, they also patched them and rolled them out in production. So everything was fixed when I woke up the day after. And that also gave me some really good arguments to my girlfriend why I was like woken up all night sending iPhone screenshots. So that, and also this time I just realized, like, this is big. Like, it was a win-win. Win for me, I had an awesome time in Thailand, and also for this company that actually got these bugs and was able to patch them during that night. So when I approach a target, I tend to do some like recon, of course. And every time you ask someone that does this, as I do for like this bug bounty programs or responsible disclosure, There's like a requirement that if somebody asks you, like, how do you start off with a target? You must say flash files. That's like a requirement, because that's the lowest hanging fruit you could possibly see. And the thing with flash files is that it's not that they're vulnerable per design, it's just that they're vulnerable, all of them. Like, there's a huge amount of SWFs that is just like, they're just vulnerable, and nobody cares. Nobody cares. There's a Git issue on JPlayer, for example. JPlayer is still huge amount of like WordPress plugins and Joomla and Drupal and like stuff like that use JPlayer inside it. Maybe it's not used anymore, but it's still in that repository for that extension. And JPlayer right now has a issue that nobody has touched for almost a year, with one way to actually execute JavaScript on the site. Nobody cares, but they're still there all over the place. So it's really powerful to just look after these, and it's almost a requirement to always look for them. Another thing I tend to look at is Facebook Connect. Facebook Connect is using OAuth. I think it's possibly that it actually uses both OAuth version 1 and version 2. Mostly, I think they're using version 2, but it doesn't matter, because the whole concept of Facebook's OAuth implementation is like breaking the specification of OAuth. Because if you look at how OAuth works, is basically to sign in on a page, you redirect the user over, connecting with your app. So let's say example.com has an app on Facebook, and you want to be able to publish actions and email for this Facebook user. You can also say that, okay, example.com is the URL that we should be sending, Facebook should be sending the user to with the token. And this one needs to be strictly validated. However, Facebook's default implementation is to just allow whatever, except it needs to be on example.com. But it doesn't really matter what subdomain it is, it doesn't matter what path it is. You need to explicitly tell it that this is the path. But per default, just adding a new app and starting off with Facebook Connect, these two are like always like fuzzy. You can do whatever you want with them. And that creates a huge surface for vulnerabilities such as an open redirect. And people like open redirect, how bad is it? But turns out that the problem with open redirects is mainly because of URL validation. And URL validation, like if you look at this URL, this looks bad, right? Like it looks invalid of some sort. It actually is invalid. Like this is not a valid URL. The problem is that browsers are really forgiving. They're like, we'll try to help you as much as possible. So if you compare it with server-side languages, if you put this into server-side languages like Java, PHP, Python, and try to like tell me the path and the domain of this URL, you'll get different results. So Java, for example, if you insert this URL into Java, it will say that, oh, this is x.com. If you insert it into PHP, it will say x.com. But if you insert it to Chrome, it will say, no, this is y.com, because the browser will transfer the backward slash to a frontward slash. And I told a bunch of people at a PHP conference about this. And there was one of the core PHP developers in the crowd. And he was very upset, of course. And he was like, yeah, so the RFC, we're following the RFC. And it turns out they don't, or didn't. So the thing is, if you look at the user info, which is the thing that we're actually abusing here, you can look at the unreserved PCT and sub-delims. Nowhere here you can find a backslash. So the backslash is actually not an invalid part of the user info in the URL. And I told him about it on the conference. And I actually went back to the source code of PHP later that day, and I saw like a issue that was actually patched. So Ilya actually went in and just, oh, now we're following the RFC, finally. So I think PHP 5.6 and PHP 7.0 and the versions after that is actually patched from this, in PHP that is. Java is still broken. I think Python is still broken also. But that's just a really interesting example of the difference between browsers and server-side languages. And the end result of this is that this happens everywhere. So here's a bunch of examples of open redirects in real life. And you can see, like, here's a perfect example of backslash, and that actually sends you to example.com instead of the victim. LinkedIn actually had the same problem, but you had to like URL decode it. Vimeo, this is actually another hack. If they actually transfer the tab character into a real tab, it will send you to example.com. And they thought that this actually meant that it was relative because you don't have double slash. But you need to think about the tab character as well. My favorite though is Zendesk, because you had to URL decode it 4 times for it to actually, okay, then I'm gonna send you to example instead of Zendesk. So they had a really good like validator, but I would so love to see the backend code of that, like URL decode like 4 times. Nobody's trying more or something. But that was actually a really interesting thing. And also in this last example, they didn't care about the backslash also. So the browser getting that in the location header will actually transfer it over to front slashes, and will send you to example.com. Another example of this, and also combined with this Facebook fuzzy redirect validation, was with Firefox. So if you look at this URL, you will see that I have URL encoded a new line and the hash sign, and then faked it as a subdomain of google.com. What do you think the browsers will do when they get this? Safari and Chrome will just like, what? No, that doesn't work. Like you can't have no, not URL encoded characters in the subdomain. Firefox, however, will just, yeah, it's example.com. I'm gonna cut it in the middle and just send you to that domain instead. And the thing was, when I told them, they were like, oh, regression, oh, bad. Like we were working with like foreign characters, and they forgot about the first range of ASCII. They still allowed them to be URL encoded or decoded. What happened was there was a new line, and then just forgot about the parts after that. And using this bug, I was able to actually use it together with the Facebook Connect on Prezi. Prezi is like a presentation platform. You're able to do like slides that zoom in and you get nauseous, but it's kind of cool back in the days. I don't think it's that cool anymore. However, they had a redirect endpoint. And the whole idea about the redirect endpoint is that Prezi has a bunch of subdomains, and they want to have a redirect endpoint on their main page to be able to get to those endpoints. And it was actually validating that you were still under Prezi.com. It wouldn't redirect you further away from Prezi.com. However, if you inserted this example, as I showed you, with a new line and also a URL decoded hash sign, they would actually send you a location header and validate it as being a Prezi subdomain. And if you remember, Firefox sent you to example.com. Prezi had a Facebook Connect, and they did not restrict the Facebook Connect to be strict on a specific path. That meant that you could actually use the redirect endpoint, because Facebook actually thought that this is not Prezi.com. But since Prezi had an endpoint with the redirect, you could use the redirect endpoint to the Facebook app of Prezi to redirect them first with the token to the redirect endpoint, which would then redirect you further to example.com with this URL decoded characters, which would end up sending the access token for Facebook to example.com. So it was like a three-step passing of this token, because the fragment part of a URL is always following if you're doing a 301 or 302 also, I think, 307 also, location redirects. And I told them, and they were like, yeah, shit, we know that we didn't restrict it. We just didn't know that you could actually abuse it. So combined with this Firefox bug, that was also patched, of course, they also like restricted their Facebook Connect and also made their open redirect endpoint much more stricter. Another thing I tend to look at is third-party scripts. Third-party scripts is like, this is 2 of the patterns I like to look for. And third-party scripts basically is like you have a blog or you have a website and you want to add some like retargeting or like calculations, or Hotjar, for example, which is like recording your users' behavior and stuff like that. So third-party scripts is awesome when it comes to being insecure. So 2 examples of that is WebTrek and Crux. So both WebTrek and Crux has this. I think some like Crux is probably partially patched. Don't know about WebTrek, but the idea here is that WebTrek, if you embed your WebTrek code into your website, there are certain parameters that you can pass to the URL of your website that WebTrek would listen to. And in this case, it was a report URL. And the report URL basically meant that you would make a request, actually embed that as a script. And the cool thing here is that it has a default URL. It's just that if you pass in the report URL, it will use that one instead. So you could use a report URL as a get parameter on your website. And just because you use the third-party script, it will load the script from the malicious web page instead. Same thing here. Actually very clear. Like it will create a new element with a script element, and it will look after the match of KXSRC. And if you find that, you will use that one instead of their default one. So I reported it to a company. You might see what it is, but I'll just try to be secret about it. And they were like, holy shit, we did not know about these vulnerabilities. We didn't even look in the third-party scripts, which is kind of stupid in the beginning, but like I started a thought there at least. So that was a good thing. The interesting thing was that the same vulnerability for Crux was actually reported a couple of months after I presented this the first time by a guy called Netfusser, which is an awesome guy, really good like XSS guy. And when I saw this report, I was like, hey, that's the Crux one. And it turns out that he was actually getting a bunch of money, of course, for it, which is cool. But the thing was that in between my release of the vulnerability in general for Crux and when he found the vulnerability on Uber with Crux, they actually patched it by only allowing the domain crux krxd.net to be allowed. And what Netfusser did was he found a JSON-P endpoint on that, which basically means that you could use the callback parameter for that URL and then trigger JavaScript on the page. So I was like, this is awesome. And when I looked at the dates, he actually posted the vulnerability to them before I went out with it. So we actually simultaneously found the same sort of issue, which is kind of cool. Another thing I tend to look for, which basically I don't think that many people are doing it, but it's happening as we speak actually, and I will get to that. But that's CSP bypasses. And there's a guy from Google talking tomorrow, same time as like 11:50 tomorrow, Lucas. And he will talk a bit more about this. But Mario Heidrich made a challenge a year ago or something with this CSP, and he was like, can you abuse this one? And it turns out it was extremely easy. And the reason for that is that the AX Google APIs hosts a lot of old versions of frameworks, such as Angular. So you just loaded in an Angular using, like if you had an XSS with this CSP, you were able to just load in Angular and trigger your JavaScript through the Angular framework. Another example that I found was Mixpanel. So if you were using Mixpanel in your CSP, because on the CDN mixpanel.com, you had JavaScript to actually do what Mixpanel does. It's basically like tracking you and analytic stuff and all this. But it turns out that Mixpanel not only hosts their JavaScript, static JavaScripts on this domain, they also host their API. And their API had JSON-P callbacks enabled. So what happened was that you could use the API with your own like key and signature for like creating this API URL, and then use a callback to trigger the script. And that would bypass completely the CSP because this domain is actually allowed to run JavaScript. And if this domain actually responds with the callback of my running code, it would actually trigger. Another example, which is actually a Google-hosted site, was googleadservices.com. And this is very, very common for sites that host ads and also not only host ads, but actually have ads online, and they want to be able to track those ads back. So basically, if you're clicking on an ad somewhere, you had to add a script for Google Ad Services to know that you were using the specific ad to click on it. And the thing was, this, I started looking at the Google lists of whitelisted domains, and this did not show up as being neither blacklisted or whitelisted. It was nowhere to be found regarding how dangerous it is to actually have that in the CSP. But it turned out that you could actually, by playing around a little bit, you were able to actually host scripts on this domain, completely accessible by anybody. So when I told one of the companies that actually had this, they were like, yeah, shit, we know now that our CSP is completely broken. Also paid me money, which was very kind. They couldn't understand, like there were no info to be found from Google that the Google Ad Services was actually malicious to have in your CSP. And the cool thing was that just a couple of months ago, and I won't spoil this too much for the talk tomorrow, but Google actually launched a CSP evaluator, which is basically able to tell you about the domains that you have in your CSP and tell you if they are like not good at all or if they're like still valid. And I was able to actually get the guys and get Lucas to add the Google Ad Services to that evaluator, so it says that please don't use this because this one is vulnerable, which is awesome. Another thing I tend to do is like look at the scope, or like do a lot of recon about the company. So one of those examples is like domains, of course, like try to find all the domains. And why would you find all the domains? What's the reason? Like, of course, you're expanding your scope, and like there are a bunch of services like VirusTotal, RateIP, SimilarWeb. There's like Passive Total, Riddler, and you can also like do brute forcing, like subroot, sublister. There's a bunch of tools of doing it. And one reason is like, of course, you can find some legacy apps, and you can find some staging platforms or developing platforms. But also, 2 years ago, I posted a blog called Hostile Subdomain Takeover. And this was kind of interesting because what this actually explained was that a bunch of cloud providers, Desk, Heroku, GitHub, AWS, are not doing domain validation at all. They don't care. Because the thing is, for example, you're starting a campaign, and you're going to place the campaign on campaign.site.com. And Heroku is nice. It's easy to launch. It's easy to like put up. So I'm going to put it on Heroku. I'm going to point my domain campaignsite.com to Heroku. So I enter a DNS record pointing it to the Heroku app. And everything works really good. Like this campaign really blew up. It was viral. Awesome. Super nice. But Heroku costs money. Like you had a big instance on Heroku. It costs money. So when the campaign is over, you shut it down completely. Like you don't need it anymore. So because Heroku costs money, but the DNS record is free, right? Like, why should we care about the DNS record? Turns out the domain validation is pretty bad on Heroku. So what happened when you shut down this Heroku website, this domain will just be like a bastard. Like it will be orphanless, like, or orphan. So anybody could go into Heroku and say, oh, this is my domain. And Heroku will just like, oh, fine, that's awesome. Cool, welcome. Because they're not doing any domain validation. And Heroku is not alone on this. Like AWS is doing it currently. Like they don't care at all. And like GitHub is also doing it. Like there's so many that does this. And when we realized that there were so many doing it wrong, we told them, like, what the hell are you doing? Like you need to validate that the user that tries to use the domain pointing to your service is actually the owner of this domain. Why are you not doing it? And everybody like responded, like, yeah, we know, it's bad. But like we prioritize convenience. We want the convenience to be the prioritized. Like we want them to be really, really easy to actually add us as their provider. And you understand, like they've stopped using us. So they're not really our customers, right? Like stupid response. And when we got that response, we were like, okay, we're going to go out and talk with these companies being affected by it. And when we talked with the companies, they were like, what the fuck are you doing? Like we did not know this. Why are the provider of this services not doing anything to validate that the domain is owned by us? Seriously. So Riot Games were like, every time I told them, and they're like, yeah, okay, here's $7,500 because we did not know this. And 2 weeks after, I found the same thing on Riot Games. And I'm like, you don't need to pay me. And they were like, gonna pay you again because this sucks. Like, they were like, just like throwing money at it because they were like, this is so bad. And I was like, please go through your DNS records. But it turns out that the DNS records of Riot Games are huge. Like, they're crazy huge. So when we also realized this, we automated it, of course. Like, we looked for patterns. I did a small, like, bash script just looking for these patterns on websites. So I had, like, collected all the subdomains and ran my scripts every day. And it turns out, like, I found a lot of shit. And a bunch of these companies or cloud providers are still, I would say that all of these are still vulnerable. Yeah. Fastly has mitigated it in one simple, bad way. but still, like a lot of these providers are vulnerable. And one day when this happened, I got a trigger, and the trigger emails me, and I got this email saying that, oh, groups.facebook.com is vulnerable through WordPress, because I have a pattern looking for this. And this pattern says basically that this domain is pointing to WordPress, but I really don't know to whom I'm going to point it to. So please log in and go to domain upgrades and add it to your domain or to your blog. So I did that, and I had to pay $13 for it. And the interesting thing here was when I tried to do this, the request that was made actually said that, no, this domain is not pointing to your blog. The blog ID is wrong. So I started looking at this request, and I saw that, okay, when you're posting the cart, you actually tell what blog ID you want to buy the domain for. And it turns out there was an insecure direct object reference here, because I was able to buy domains pointing to another blog and still be able to own it by myself. The only problem was that I need to find the ID of the blog. And to do a proper proof of concept for Facebook, I had to spin through 44 million IDs on WordPress. So what I did was I tried it on my own blog, which I knew the ID for, and I was able to do the proof of concept of my ID. And then I started doing brute forcing, just trying all the IDs of these 44 million IDs. And at the same time, I told Facebook, like, hey, I don't have a proper proof of concept except my own example here. But I'm just currently going through all the 44 million IDs of the blogs on WordPress.com, and I will probably find it someday, but let us know. And they actually just responded like, okay, fine, here's $5,000. We understand the problem here. And since I didn't like give them a proper proof of concept, I actually like, let's donate them to something funny. So this was just before, or this was like during the CFP of B-Sides or something. So I actually donated it to B-Sides. Not that I wanted to like make a bribe or something, but it was fun. Like it was a fun time going to B-Sides that year also. So this was earlier this year actually. So what happened when Facebook donates it to a non-profit, they actually double the money. So they got $10,000 for that thing, which was good. So doing this automation actually ends up resulting in very interesting reports. So 2 weeks ago, I think it's 2 weeks ago actually, so I sent a report to Uber that says, hello, 3 hours ago, this domain started to be vulnerable, which is kind of revealing that you're doing something automated, right? and what happened here was that it's a CloudFront instance. So if you point a domain to CloudFront on AWS doesn't do any domain validation at all. So if you see this, and most importantly, the bad request is one indicator that this domain pointing to CloudFront does not have any distribution connected to it. Then anybody can go in and just say, this is mine, and I'm going to host my own stuff on it. So I sent this to them 2 weeks ago, and they're like, yeah, your script strike again, man. Good job. And I'm like, yeah, I'm your DNS guardian. They also like paid money for it. Like it was a symbolic sum, of course, because I'm just not doing anything at all. I'm just like automating it, and got an email. I actually got the email 7 a.m. in the morning, and I was leaving my daughter on daycare, but I was just like, I had to postpone the leaving to the daycare center just to write down the report. So I was like late to the daycare, and like really hard to explain why, but it was actually pretty interesting. And this domain validation is scanning and things. I've been like trying to explain to people that this is really bad, like trying to publish articles about it. We actually got some out in the public press also. But the thing is, it has grown beyond just doing this domain matching. So in September this year, there was a blog post coming out that said that a Nepalese hacking group got $10,000 from Uber. And the reason why they got those money because they were able to read internal emails of Uber. And I started reading this blog, and in the end, it actually said, like, thanks to Detective 5 for actually finding this issue from the beginning, or bringing it into light. And it turns out this bug was actually pretty interesting, because there are like 3 email providers, like cloud services doing emails, that is currently used today by everybody. The first one is SES by AWS, the simple email service. The other two is Mailgun and SendGrid. You know about them? Probably. You probably don't know, like if you don't know about them, you're probably using them anyway. Like they're like owning the whole competition in terms of email, transaction emails, sending out newsletters. Like if you're using a newsletter service, though they in the back end is probably using SendGrid or Mailgun or SES for sure, because they are like owning almost the complete market. And what this guy found, he was going out with the all details. Like he found that these services, you were able to add your domains to these services, and when you also add your DNS records pointing to these services, not only do these services work with outbound emails, they're like, yeah, so we're really good at outbound emails for our customers. Let's do inbound emails also. So they had a bunch of functionality called inbound parse, and the other one had something called routing, which basically meant that if you connected your domains to them, they exposed MX records in their DNS. And that means that they're able to take inbound emails also. And the problem with SendGrid, for example, was that the validation of adding an inbound parse for a domain was not correlating with validating the domain for outbound mail. The incoming email did not have any domain validation at all. That was the biggest problem. So what this guy did was just add mailproduber.com and added a webhook to like an ngrok session or a like request bin. And he started to get all the emails that was sent to this domain. And the interesting thing was, when he went out with this blog post, everything was patched. When I read it, I was like, this can be bypassed for sure. So what I did was, I went to SendGrid first, and I saw that, oh, you can't add this because you need to validate your white label domain. And when I looked at the requests, it was posting everything to API version 3. So what I did, I went to API version 2, no validation. Same thing again. So I sent another email like, can you please tell SendGrid that they're still vulnerable, Uber, because now I can read your emails once again. Same thing all over again. And also, Mailgun also had a domain validation, but the domain validation there was just, if the domain already is added, you can't add it again. And the interesting thing with Mailgun was that not only do they want you to add the domain to your account, which also would end up in having the domain validation or domain conflict check being run. What you could do was also, like if you want tracking on Mailgun, add this subdomain, email.example.com. Point it also to us, because that's awesome. Then you get tracking, you get everything, you get bounce backs, you get open clicks and everything. And the problem with the CNAME was that the CNAME points to Mailgun, and Mailgun has MX records pointing to Mailgun. And what happens with a CNAME, if you add a CNAME to a domain that has MX records, your CNAME will also have the MX records. So that means that I can just go in, and in combination with that, there's a bunch of whitelisted aliases for emails. Whitelisted aliases means that they're able to, they have a higher privilege on that domain. So having the access to these email addresses gives you, for example, the ability to create SSL certificates. This is actually an allowed verification method to validate that you should have a SSL certificate issued. So these in combination made it possible to add this subdomain that was the CNAME pointing to them, adding that to Mailgun instead, and then use that to get the postmaster emails. And this is an example. This was parse.com, which is owned by Facebook, also had this problem. So basically, parse.com wasn't using Mailgun, but they still had this domain entry pointing for the tracking. The CNAME to Mailgun was still there. That meant that the MX record was exposed on email.parse.com, which basically meant that I could go into Mailgun and say, email.parse.com is my domain. And they were just like, yeah, fine, absolutely. And I would say, please route all emails that come to this domain and route them to me. And this is an example of that. Here's a picture of a guy with a horse. So a couple of years ago, I have two friends, and two friends find a XSE on, like an external XML entity bug on Google. And what happened was that they were able to read files on their production server. This is actually a GIF with bottles. The fun story about this is that they actually contacted Google and like, yeah, here's the bug. And they were like, we're fixing it now. And they were asking like, how much is this worth? and Google actually responded with this GIF, like falling out bottles. And he ended up getting $10,000 for that bug because it was so bad in terms of the severity. And also, they actually just, like, that was maybe one of the reasons, but probably the biggest reason why they shut down the Google toolbar thing was because of this. So when this happened, this is like an additional story to this. So when this happened, they told me, bad idea. They told me about it, and I was like, XXE, okay, what is that? Started to reading up on it. And as I did that, I saw their example, because as soon as you tried it on the Google toolbar, it ended up being public, which was like also adding to the severity. You couldn't like secretly do this without like exposing it for everybody. So I was like, I need to try if the method that they're using, if I can do it myself. So what happened was that during the time that Google was vulnerable, and since we're working at the same company, I was like, I need to try this myself. So suddenly I also do the same thing, posting etc password publicly on this Google toolbar page, which was like not a good idea, but like that was one way to see that it was actually valid. And when that happened, Google came to my friends and like, who is this guy? What is this doing? Like, what the hell? Are you telling people about this vulnerability? Seriously? And they're like, no. He's working at our company. Like, we work as a team. Like, here's his IP address. Here's everything. Here's, like, all the personal information you can possibly, like, get from me. And they're like, okay, fine. That's cool. That's good. So suddenly now, Google had my personal information and my IP address. And I did not know anything except my friends telling me about it. So, but when I saw that it was working, I was trying out every possible place that Google had that took XML files from you. And I was trying all of them, like madness. Like I was like pounding all the places that they took XML files. And I found one place called the Google Merchant Center. And the Google Merchant Center worked like this. You inserted a XML, and the XML contained information about your app, such as how much does it cost, and what endpoint is this app located at. And I started playing with that, and this was like a late Friday night or something, and suddenly I get an email from Google Security, like, are you looking at Google Marketplace for XXE? And I'm like, yeah, should I stop? They're like, yeah, we filed a bug for it. For what? I still don't know today what the bug actually was, because I played with it. I did not find anything, probably because I was so sucky at it back then. But I still don't know, and a couple of weeks later, I get, hey, $5,000. So I'm like, what? Seriously? I still don't know. I know there's people in this Google security team here. I'll probably ask them, like, what's the bug internally here? And since I got this, I was like, this is not my money. I can't possibly accept this money. So I actually donated them as well to Doctors Without Borders. And what happens then is Google is adding also $5,000. So $10,000 came to Doctors Without Borders. Yeah, thanks. So the cool thing was also that Doctors Without Borders suddenly get a donation from Google for $10,000. And when that happens, they contacted them and like, is this like a corporate donation? Or no, it's a guy in Sweden that wants to send money. So this is just by proxy. And they're like, who's this guy? Seriously, why is he sending us $10,000? And they had to like explain it in a long email thread on like, yeah, so he hacked us, and like, hacked us, so it's not valid money? Yeah, wait a second. It is valid money. And they're like, can we meet this guy? We want to meet him. And they emailed me, can you come to San Francisco tomorrow? And I'm like, I'm in Sweden. No, unfortunately no. So they were actually trying to hunt me down, and it's really scary to have Doctors Without Borders, right, trying to hunt you down. Like, you don't want that. I wanted to bring up a fun thing also, which is kind of funny. It's just a stupid thing, which is still there, and you can play around with it. So view source in Chrome is actually a HTML page. Like, it's parsing your HTML differently by actually showing it to you. The cool thing with the view source is that you can have links in your view source. And this link is actually clickable, and clicking on that link will actually send you to example.com. Turns out you can actually have JavaScript in the view source, which actually clicking on that will trigger without the domain though, so there's no origin at all. Like, the origin is empty. And there's actually some validation going on, because not all of the attribute names are actually clickable. So you will see here that that the SRC is actually clickable, and the SRC doesn't really care about what element you're actually using. And it will always trigger the JavaScript being clickable. The action one, though, is not like, I think action one is only working on form or something. There's some validation going on. And the cool thing is that the origin is empty, so you can't really do anything about the origin, or you can't like do requests to that domain. However, if you were able to actually have content on a site that you were able to add this to, you were actually, on the view source, be able to actually like get that data out. This still works. So this is like, I've been trying to play with it for so long, and I actually told Mario Heidrich about it, and he was like, there must be a way. And like he sent me some emails after that, like a couple of weeks later. I'm still thinking about that thing. And back then, it was actually possible to redirect a user directly to view source by doing a meta redirect. And that would end up in being like, if you went to this page which was doing the meta redirect, you would be able to run code after clicking something. And this is my marquee party on the example.com, for example. But I don't see a possible like attack doing this. It's just a stupid bug that is still there. But they actually fixed the redirect to view source. So the redirect to view source is fixed during this year, unknown when, but for some reason they actually patched that one. So you're not able to redirect people directly to view source. So it's a big social engineering thing here going on, trying to actually exploit this. Last thing I will talk about is GitHub, and I will talk about an article posted like 2.5 years ago about, from Runa Sandvik. And she found that people were actually gathering credentials from GitHub. You might have seen this because this was back in the days when like Bitcoin mining was a big thing. So people were Bitcoin mining by gathering credentials on AWS or on GitHub for AWS. And there was a bunch of open source tools coming up called GitRob, for example, that's like scanning for all these credentials. And when I saw this, and this was like earlier this year, I actually thought about, okay, so you know about spear phishing, like you're targeting a company specifically and you target them with emails trying to fool them. So what about spear searching? Can I target a company and I go through all their LinkedIn profiles trying to find the developers, and I try to find their organization on GitHub and trying to find all the employees on GitHub for this company, and then I go through all their commits and all their history of committing code to GitHub. And doing that, it turns out to be extremely, extremely vulnerable in sort of ways, because people are committing credentials to GitHub. And this was actually working credentials, so I, of course, told these companies. One example was also Groupon having their Salesforce login. Salesforce, if you know, is like a CRM on crack. And when I tried this, like they have a responsible disclosure and all that, so I tried this credential just to validate that, like, is this old or new? This one presented me like, can you please change your password? Tell me your new password. And I was like, no, I'm not changing password for this. And I told them, and they're like, since I did not log in, they were like, yeah, it wasn't anything important in there. like, okay, interesting. So GitHub is a version control system, or Git by itself. So when you start looking at the history of commits, you would see this, which is kind of interesting. The green one is what's been added, and the red one is what's been removed. And they actually just, oops, like we're going to remove our credentials here and replace them with XXX. And this was actually valid credentials, because AWS does not check in history, of course. Like there would be huge amount of job to do it. So they only check the current ones. So if you're quick on removing your credentials, putting them in your version history, AWS won't even revoke these ones if they're there. So you're able to actually find valid credentials if you start looking in the history. And one indicator that something is clearly wrong is when you see this. You're like, they're not using environmental variables, and you see XXX. Let's look at the history and see how those XXX came in there. This is a meta one. This is like Salesforce login for GitHub on GitHub. With an awesome sucky password also, but hopefully these didn't work back then, and hopefully they were just fake or something. But it was still funny to see, like, we're from GitHub and this is vulnerable. Another company that I started targeting for this also had their Salesforce login on Facebook, on GitHub, on Facebook. That would be crazy. But yeah, they had a Salesforce login with they were doing a bot calculating reports and aggregating them, and and I saw the user and credentials, and then I know the CISO on that company. So I actually tried those credentials on Salesforce. And I came in, and what I saw was so bad. Because I was an administrator of their Salesforce account. And I saw all their dashboards, like this is an IPO company. And I saw all these dashboards, sales dashboards, all employees, everything. This was a Friday night, 2:35. So what I did, I sent an email to the CISO. Long time no see, you should probably read this now. This is how I spend my Friday nights, by the way. So what happened was that 2 minutes later, I get an email. What number can I reach you at? And I gave him my number, and he calls me up. And I'm like, hey, Jay, how are you? And like, hey, what's up? And I'm like, yeah, so I have these credentials that I found on GitHub. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so it's a Salesforce login, and the user is called ConsoleBot. And to me, it looks pretty much that this user is actually an administrator. And I can see basically everything. Silence. Fuck, shit, fuck, shit. Okay, send me the report, I get back to you, click. And I was like getting goosebumps, like, what the hell happened? And it turns out the credentials has been public for 9 days. And he got back to me a couple of days later, and he told me, like, okay, nobody else except you were actually logging into this account, so that's good. And we're actually doing bug bounty on impact. And that means that we're going to pay you out depending on the impact of this vulnerability. And this vulnerability was because of a developer, of course. Like, the developer accidentally actually put this online on GitHub as a gist, for example, to be precise. And the thing was, this was the worst thing that could actually happen to them. So they sent me an email for $30,000 just to explain to me that this is a worst case scenario. And finding this was so valuable to us because we would not have seen this until it was too late. That's it. Thank you very much.